It's the Friday Cocktail, presented by Anna Glowinski.
When you work on radio, you can actually get away with a lot. You could be sitting here picking your nose, drinking a cup of tea, or even you could turn up to work naked and no one would know the difference. But my next guest has ruined my very first question for him because he's joined me on video call, and I was going to ask Philip Carr Gomm, who is the author of A Brief History of Nakedness, what he's wearing, but I can see that he actually has many layers on. Hi, Philip. How are you doing?
Hi, very nice to see you. Hi.
Very nice to see you. So as I can see, you do have a jacket, a body warmer and a shirt, and you haven't taken them out.
Even though I'm in Ibiza. I mean, it's lovely and sunny outside, but inside it's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, the houses are built for coolness. I've noticed that. We're in southern Spain.
Right.
So we have the same issue. Are you a fan of walking around naked, taking your clothes off?
Yes. I
knew it.
I discovered it late in life, really, when I was writing a biography of my spiritual teacher, and I discovered in his will that he'd left a chalet in a naturist resort in outside St Albans in Hertfordshire. And I went along on the hottest day of the year to interview some of the elderly folk who still had memories of him. And I was dressed and they were all naked, and they didn't invite me to undress. And then we went and sat and had lunch. And I saw there was one moment, it was just one moment. There was a grandfather with his son and daughter-in-law and grandchild having lunch, a sort of picnic lunch on the grass, and they were all naked. And it was so beautiful and lovely. And I was so hot. I said, can I take my clothes off? And they said, of course you can. We didn't ask you because we didn't want to embarrass you. You're free. This is a place of freedom, And it took just a few moments of sort of embarrassment and shyness. And then I realized this is lovely. Went swimming and sunbathing. It was great.
Yeah, and I mean, you're a psychologist as well. So what's your sort of take on that from a psychological point of view? From you personally, that barrier, and I'm touching my clothes here as I talk to you, you're taking that barrier off of yourself in front of a group of people. How did that affect you sort of psychologically?
Yeah, it's very powerful, isn't it? It's very interesting to see how, because it's deeply connected with shame, and shame is a very uncomfortable emotion to feel. And, that's a whole sort of topic one could dive into about shame, where it comes from and how it is generated and so on. But it's extremely uncomfortable, and it's connected with that. And so if you can manage to get through that, get over that, there can come a tremendous sense of liberation and freedom from that.
Absolutely. Do you know what? Actually, speaking to you, I say that because you're saying that you came to being naked at a later age. You sort of discovered it later, whereas I sort of went the other way. When I was younger, when I was like a free-spirited party girl, I used to take my clothes off all the time. I just thought it was hilarious. I'd be like, let's get naked. It's like that song, let's get naked just for a laugh. And then I got older and maybe it's a shame or maybe it's becoming a family woman. It started to feel more inappropriate, and that's just not what I would do if I went to a party with my friends these days. What would you say the psychology around that is? Have I become more embarrassed? Has society put its pressure on me?
Well, I think one of the sad things to observe over the years, I mean, basically what happened towards the end of the 20th century, sounds like a long way away, but of course it wasn't that far long ago. Towards the end of the 20th century, there was this moment, it was in 1999 when, I think it was 99, The Full Monty and Calendar Girls came out. And both those films are really interesting because if you think about, if you imagine pitching to a Hollywood producer, the idea about a film about a bunch of guys in a northern town in England who are unemployed and they decide to strip. You think, well, no, we're not going to make that film. It doesn't sound. But in fact, it was so fantastic. I don't know if you remember, but Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister, did a little sort of copied the dance in the job centre queue for the cameras. It was a huge success.
Yeah.
And it featured all sorts of interesting issues around, parenthood and depression, and and the closing scene was when they all took everything off, and it's like freedom, liberation, all right. And then Calendar Girls, in a similar way, as some older women, and they did the calendar for a good cause. One of their husbands died of leukemia or something, and they raised money for a hospital. And this triggered a wave of people doing naked calendars. So that the end of the century, there was this real feeling of that it wasn't sort of sleazy or smutty to be naked. So that was great. But what's happened since then, I think in the last 25 years of this next century, is that social media and, the very real concerns of movements against abuse, the Me Too movement, but also, the abuse of children and, within the church and so on and so on. All these pressures, but above all, I think, hyper-consciousness about our appearance has come back into the picture. So we're much more conscious of our appearance. The fact that people can take photographs of us, everybody's got a camera on them, for instance, now, which wasn't the case in the past. But I think also, into your personal experience, that may have been something to do with it, the general cultural sort of milieu. But it's also that there is, because when kids are really young, I've got grandchildren, they love they like to be naked all the time, and they're 2 years old, and why bother with clothes?
Yeah.
And then again, you might have another phase, kind of when you're younger and you want to party and it's wild and all the rest of it. And then there's having kids and settling down and the mundane routine and all the rest of it, and maybe that inhibits one. I don't know, until you become old and grey like me, and then you think, oh, to hell with that, I don't care what anybody thinks. You find freedom again.
I just want to be comfortable. And what inspired you to write this book in the first place? Obviously you told us about a powerful moment for you in terms of feeling liberated, taking your clothes off, but then to delve into the history of nakedness, that's a whole nother level.
Yeah. Well, it was writing this other book, this biography, when I came across this naturist resort, and I found I enjoyed it. And I've spent, all of my adult life researching psychology and levels of consciousness, states of consciousness. And what I found with nakedness is it's one of the fastest ways to change your state of consciousness. If you took your clothes off now, your state of consciousness would change. The contents of your content, you'd become much more aware. You might become embarrassed. You might become, feel more free, whatever it is. You'd have a whole range but you'd have an instant change. And, and that interested me. And I kind of delved into it. And then I discovered that, a lot of people said to me, how can you write a whole book about being naked? What's there to say except it's the state of being undressed? But in fact, everything's there, so the first third of the book is about the nakedness in religion and spirituality. Because you have all these interesting phenomena, like, the naked Babas of India, when the Kumbh Mela, this huge festival where you have hundreds and hundreds, possibly thousands of naked men, sort of sadhus, running into the Ganges. And then you have, you have all sorts of interesting things like Christian nudists. It's full of wonderful photographs, the book. I managed to find a photograph of Christian nudist ceremonies. And and then the second half of the book is nakedness in politics, because I discovered that's a whole rich field as well, particularly Catholic countries, Spain and so on. Politicians have, in the past appeared naked. Always with a potted plant in the right place, of course. Sort of saying, I've got nothing to hide. That would be a sort of classic poster for a Spanish politician or something like that. It's probably changed in the last 25 years, but certainly in the 20th century, that's what was happening. There was a wonderful women's party in Sweden, and they followed the example of the Calendar Girls, and they just posed, the entire group of MPs just posed for a photograph in the nude.
And what is the messaging behind that?
Well, yeah, we've got nothing to hide.
It was that, yeah.
Yeah. We're who we are. It's what you see is what you get. Got nothing to hide. We're honest and direct and simple.
And you said that you go quite far back in history, different cultures, India there, go back a few hundred years. Lady Godiva is also mentioned in your book. So can you just tell us, some of the little stories about the changes or how things were perceived, nakedness back in the day, whichever day that you want to pick?
Yeah, and the politics of it. Well, the earliest story I could find relating politics and nakedness was the Lady Godiva story, which unfortunately is probably apocryphal. It's probably not true. But it's a very interesting story because it's when her husband, I think he was the king, if I remember rightly, put up taxes. She said she championed the poor people. And she said, if you raise taxes, I will parade naked through the streets. And he ignored her, put up the taxes, and so she rode naked through the streets, and everybody respected her wonderful gesture of solidarity with them. So they stayed indoors, except for Peeping Tom, and that's where the story of Peeping Tom comes in, who had a peep. But so that's probably fictional. But looking into fact, what's interesting about nakedness in politics is it's mainly women who drive it. So one of the earliest protests was called Breasts Not Bombs, which took place in the United States, where women bared their breasts to protest against nuclear weapons, or bombing in Vietnam or something. I can't actually remember where, but bombing in general. And then you find naked protests going all over the place, including the most recent ones being Pussy Riot in Russia. And so it's because what's so interesting about naked protest is, on the one hand, it's a very powerful statement. And if you sort of want to get a message out, the fastest, the sort of quickest and most dramatic way you can get it out is just to write it on your body. So an Iranian woman wrote "Stop the War" on her buttocks in Arabic and English, and took her clothes off in a fountain in Central Park. And she was arrested very quickly, unfortunately. But she got the message out there. So it's been mainly women who've driven protests because it's a statement of power and attention seeking. But also, of course, when you're naked, you're incredibly vulnerable. And this is what people who aren't into nakedness don't get. They talk about, it's awful. There's these people strutting around without any clothes, showing themselves off. They're just exhibitionists and all the rest of it. But the reality is you or listeners may have experienced, when you go on a beach in Spain, my understanding is that if you go towards the left of the beach, certainly that's how it is on Ibiza anyway, that it's okay to take your clothes off. And so the beaches that I visited in Ibiza, that's on the left side, you'll always find a few people without clothes on. But you feel vulnerable. As soon as you're naked, you're vulnerable. So politically, it's an interesting sort of demonstration of both your vulnerability and your humanity and your power to draw attention. And of course, the Breasts Not Bombs thing, women doing it. These are the bodies that you guys, you generals and soldiers and bombers have been born out of. We are the mothers, They're very, very powerful, And then the third section of my book, I go into nakedness in the arts and entertainment, in the opera, ballet, theatre, comedy,
And so what do you have? What's the interest there or the angle that you've taken when you're talking about nakedness in the arts?
In the arts, well, it was really just, this, of all the books I've written, I suppose this was the most fun project, I have to say. And when the publisher told me I had to do the picture research, normally picture research is done by somebody else in a publishing house. For some reason, they told me to do it or asked me to do it. And that was such fun, digging out all these amazing photographs. And I think really just looking at, who's used nakedness in the opera, for instance, and what are the photographs? Wow, how extraordinary. Why were they doing it? What effect did it have? Very rare in ballet, there's a priceless quote from some famous choreographer saying, the trouble with using it in ballet is some bits go one way while the other bits want to go the other way.
I guess there's lots of jumping up in the air in ballet, isn't it? Yeah. And if you're already giving an eyeful, then and how far are people willing to go? You know, if you're confident being naked, but then are you confident jumping and being naked at the same time in front of an audience? It's the next level. And what were your conclusions really about, some of the stories and the people in the opera that took their clothes off? And you said it was powerful. Were they sending a message, or, is there a different, I suppose what I'm trying to ask is there a different feeling when people are taking their clothes off in the arts, in an entertainment world, or is it still as a tool for some sort of protest or messaging?
No, well, it can be sometimes in the arts, but often it's, say for instance, pop musicians who get naked. It's often part of the kind of wild kind of message they're conveying of, breaking conventions and just demonstrating their freedom. But so generally, I think in a way, the message in all three spheres, religion, politics, and entertainment, the underlying message is about freedom and about humanity. It's like you can be free, and this is the sort of ultimate sort of way of expressing your freedom. And because I remember, apropos of that, going on a long hike and getting to the top of this hill in Sussex, very hot day, nobody around. And I thought I'd take my clothes off. And when I got down to my kind of underpants, I wondered I thought, is this illegal? Am I actually breaking the law? I'm not entirely sure. And then the philosophical implications of that came to me. I thought, how odd it would be if I can only exist in this world if part of me is covered up. What does that mean? You can only exist in this world. You can only, if part of me is covered. Very strange concept. So fundamentally freedom, but in religion, funnily enough, it's often used as a way of sort of getting closer to God, in the sense of there's nothing between me and the divine. So in the Jain tradition, wonderful stream of religion coming out of India, that's their belief. They have a whole, they have naked monks in that tradition, and the idea is there's nothing in the way, just me and the divine. And then with Christianity, strangely enough, is very nude friendly, because of this thing in the Bible where it says God was made in man's image. Man was made in God's image. So you can't say that a naked man is disgusting, because you're saying God is disgusting. So theologically, that's a real plus for the nudists. Hence the rationale for being a naked Christian.
That surprises me, actually, because you often relate Christianity with conservatism.
Yeah, and by eating the apple and, shame and sin. And so there's that whole thing around that as well in Christianity. But there's, as with a lot of Christianity, there's all sorts of different factions that disagree wildly with each other. So I'm sure a lot of fundamentalist factions would be horrified at the concept of naked and of nude Christians, but they do exist.
Do you know what? I actually lived with a couple a while back. I found them on Airbnb. This was about 7, 8, 9 years ago. And they lived in a field in a little van. And for reasons that I won't go into now, I ended up living in this field with them for a while. And they were constantly naked. And they opened up their field to Airbnb for a campsite. But they didn't tell anybody online that it was naked. And I vividly remember this fairly young couple signing up to go camping there, and they drove in. They were German. They drove in. this naked Christian hippie who was wearing a pair of sandals and a pair of gardening gloves. His hands were covered. So walks up to the car, everything flapping out, sticks his gloved hand out to shake their hand, and they jumped straight back in the car, backed out, and drove away because they weren't expecting it.
Is that, yes, people need to know. I mean, it's funny, being German, the Germans are very naked friendly.
Yeah.
nakedness in Germany is much more accepted than it is in the UK. But obviously, yes, they were surprised. But there are the famous naked gardeners in England, and they own a sort of big home and a big beautiful garden which is open to the public, and then once a year they invite the public to be naked in the garden, and I have some friends who went. They said it's absolutely wonderful.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah,
that is fascinating. And what about on the flip side of this, like the concept of covering up? Do you only talk about nakedness and the feeling of being naked and the examples of people taking their clothes off, or do you also go into the reasons why we've ended up covering up? You know, what does it mean to cover up? Why is it enshrined in law that certain body parts have to be covered up, and the control perhaps that it means, or what does it mean?
Yeah. Well, only in at some level, it's I do mention it, and it's obvious that the thing about is that that part of the body is associated with excretion and with sexuality. So two really kind of difficult areas, even and then there's the sort of hygiene perspective as well. So at one level, it's just a kind of obvious thing, and then you've got the climate and
of course.
and all the rest of it. But what is interesting is, of course, that not long ago, I mean, maybe our great grandparents, possibly our grandparents, they used to wear far more restrictive clothing. Men used to wear corsets, for instance. I mean, not all men, obviously, but there were, corsets, people, so there was a whole movement in the kind of from about 1920s onwards called clothing reform. There was this whole sort of wave of reform movements where they were looking at sexual reform, agricultural reform. And there was this big clothing reform movement where women started rebelling against wearing sort of tight clothing and lots of clothing, and men with stiff collars and tight corsets and things. So that was a part of that movement. And then it was actually the outbreak of TB that killed so many people that was really the trigger for the naturist movement in Europe, because there was a Swiss doctor called Rollier who discovered that they would, when people got TB, they would put them up in wards and with the closed windows and keep them warm and tuck them up and all the rest of it. And he discovered that actually having people naked in the sunlight and the fresh air was more likely to cure them than the reverse. And so it began as a health movement in Europe.
And obviously you have, you feel that there's lots of benefits to being naked, whether that's healthful or psychological. If you were in charge of the laws of nakedness, censorship online, what you could wear to school, to the streets, on the beach, would you change things the way they are? What would you have in place?
Yes, I think you see one of the problems around the shame and whenever you push something away, it gets stronger. So one of the things I wouldn't, when in the initial wave of my enthusiasm, sort of 20 years ago or something, I would have said, yes, let's have nakedness everywhere and just get rid of all the laws. I didn't think that's kind of quite right. But what I do think is that that by repressing it, you actually create the problem. So there was a thing called the Free Beach movement, which was a group of naturists who pushed back against a campaign launched by fundamentalist Christians in the United States to close down all the clothing-free or clothing-optional beaches in the United States. And they came up with this fabulous press release that said, no, we want you to close down any religious establishment within 10 miles of any beach, because the amount of abuse that has occurred in religious establishments is proven and is huge and horrifying. The amount of abuse that has occurred on a clothing optional beach, there just isn't any. I mean,
Wow.
So that's a really good argument, I think, for being more liberal and more tolerant.
Yeah. You can't argue with the numbers there, can you? I suppose. It's a great story. Listen, we've got to start wrapping it up. So I'm going to ask one final question specifically about the book. It sounds quite lighthearted, but also sounds like it's got a message in it. What would you like readers to take away from having read it?
Well, there was a review I had from a professor at Oxford, or Cambridge, who said, whatever you look like physically, unless you've come straight out of having an operation in hospital, when you finish this book, when you take off your clothes in the evening and look at yourself in the mirror, you will find a big smile on your face. It's that and that sums it up. I think the book is funny. I had another review that said this is about as fun as history gets. But it's also educational. I think there's a lot of weird, wacky facts and interesting facts and history in it, as well as some very funny stuff too. Oh,
I'm all over it. It sounds absolutely brilliant. And Philip, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much for taking the time.
A pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye. So that was Philip Carr Gomm there, and he was talking about his book, A Brief History of Nakedness. You can find it on the Talk Radio Europe bookshop, or pop it into Google and find it from all the best bookstores.